Committed to working with the government and the Canadian public to ensure comprehensive regulations and mitigate the public safety concerns associated with cannabis are established prior to legalization. We support many of the overall goals of the Act while recognizing that other stakeholders are better equipped to provide specialized knowledge in the area of public health and in social services. We also support efforts to deter and reduce criminal activity by imposing serious criminal penalties for those breaking the law, especially those who import and export cannabis and who provide cannabis to youth. Sincere thanks are extended to all members of this committee for allowing the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police the opportunity to offer a comment and suggestions on Bill C-45. We look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
And thank you for your very comprehensive brief, verbal and written. Now we go to Ontario Provincial Police, Deputy Commissioner Barnum.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee here today. As Ontario Provincial Police Service, the OPP has a unique mandate. The OPP delivers frontline policing services to more than 70% of Ontario municipalities, which is over 13 million people. It is also responsible for a wide array of programs and services for the province, including criminal investigation, technical expertise, Indigenous policing, traffic safety, and specialized response. In particular, the Investigations and Organized Crime Command is dedicated to safeguarding Ontario's communities against those individuals or groups involved in organized and serious crime. We are committed to engagement and education, augmented by enforcement, to reduce harm and victimization. In preparation for the proposed Bill C-45, it is important to consider the impact this Act will have on policing operations across the country. As a member of the CACP, the OPP supports the comments and recommendations presented here by our esteemed colleagues. My remarks today will focus on those key elements within the legislation that are most alarming for the Ontario Provincial Police and could, if not implemented in a strategic and staged approach, compromise the safety and well-being of Ontarians. The first subject I would like to address is the cultivation of cannabis within the home. The OPP is concerned by the impact home production will have on our communities and does not support the federal approach of growing up to 4 cannabis plants per residence. A number of risk factors arise with personal cultivation, including exposure to youth, health and safety matters such as mold and fire hazards, overproduction, and the potential for trafficking. The report provided to the Standing Committee by the CACP highlights the exploitation that has occurred under the various medical marijuana schemes and is the OPP's belief that this abuse will be even more prevalent under the recreational system. Even though Health Canada currently estimates 1 indoor plant will yield 28 grams, this does not represent the reality of marijuana cultivation. OPP drug enforcement experts estimate average yields of 60 to 100 grams per indoor plant. Likewise, most indoor cannabis plants grow to a height of approximately 4 feet, exceeding the 100 centimeter restriction. If we consider a 200-unit housing complex in any urban or suburban center, where half the units cultivate 4 marijuana plants or more, we can estimate anywhere from 400 to 600 plants being grown in one building throughout the year without proper ventilation, adequate electrical capacity, and in close proximity to children. This scenario severely jeopardizes public safety. In addition, we may see a rise in home or property invasions, known to police as grow rips. The frequency of these occurrences in communities placed by the OPP has steadily increased and continues to increase over the past 3 years. OPP experts expect it will encounter a hefty workload and investigative pressures related to the overproduction of marijuana in the home, possession limits, break-enters and thefts, and the diversion to the illicit market, all of which cannot be adequately managed within existing resource allocations. I would now like to bring your attention to the challenges related to training. Given the tight timelines of federal legalization, the OPP, like many policing partners, is apprehensive about the level of our enforcement readiness come July 2018. There are approximately 6,000 uniformed members of the OPP who will require training on the laws and the ticketing system. It is anticipated that there will be significant cost implications for additional training resources and tools to ensure officers are aware of their authorities and proper procedures. The The OPP foresees numerous challenges as we transition to a new enforcement environment, namely, how will officers determine weight for possession charges? Will confusion occur around possession age and limits from different forms of cannabis? How will police agencies manage seizures and the return of property? Will validation testing occur? What will the police role within the Health Canada inspection process look like? Bill C-45 and the subsequent training and enforcement considerations will also greatly impact Ontario's Indigenous policing programs, including the 20 Indigenous communities administered by the OPP. Some communities are already experiencing a substance abuse crisis, and it is feared that there will be additional health impacts, particularly for Indigenous youth, when cannabis is legalized. It is expected that Indigenous police services, whose resources are already underfunded and unable to increase capacity, will experience significant enforcement challenges as well. One of the greatest concerns for the OPP is the protection of youth, including Indigenous youth. The OPP recognizes that difficulties will arise in attempting to enforce youth possession and the social sharing of cannabis. It is our belief that social sharing opens the door for illicit drug trafficking to be concealed as sharing among youth. Although the federal legislation sets a minimum age of 18 and permits youth to possess and distribute up to 5 grams of cannabis, the OPP supports a minimum age of 19 with zero possession limit for youth below the minimum age. This would allow ticketing for youth possession, consumption, and sharing of cannabis as a provincial offense, along with the authority to seize cannabis from young persons. It is the OPP's view that a provincial ticketing mechanism will prevent youth from entering the criminal justice system when charged with cannabis-related offenses. In cooperation with the provincial government and our policing and community partners, the OPP will engage in an education campaign directed at youth to address the new possession laws, drug-impaired driving, and the dangers of illicit cannabis. With respect to organized crime, it is difficult to deny the opportunities for criminal enterprise in the cannabis marketplace. The illegal cannabis trade generates billions of dollars annually and has established a foothold within the medical marijuana industry. The OPP has investigated dozens of Health Canada authorized medical marijuana grow operations whose plant yields grossly exceed the permitted amounts. For example, while investigating a grow operation in a commercial building, it was determined that a total of 508 plants could be grown under 4 Health Canada authorizations. In fact, we found 979 plants were located in the building. Some of the mature plants were between 8 and 9 feet tall. If we apply the Health Canada yield estimate, the 508 plants should have produced 31 pounds of dried marijuana. Instead, the actual yield was 2,032 pounds. If not seized by police, this illicit product would have been sent to the street-level dealers and supplied to illegal dispensaries throughout the province. While the Ontario government has announced plans to pursue an enforcement strategy to shut down illegal operations, it is anticipated that these dispensaries will continue to pose problems for law enforcement. And, just like the contraband tobacco industry, organized crime will seek to subvert the legal cannabis retail system by selling at a lower price. This includes the sale of seeds, cloned plants, and dried cannabis. The federal government must ensure that pricing for marijuana is reasonable. If not, it will promote growth in the illicit trade. It is also the OPP's belief that Health Canada's security clearance processes do not go far enough to prevent the infiltration of organized crime in the medical marijuana industry. As the legalization of cannabis approaches, individuals who make application to own and administer federally regulated production facilities, along with their employees and any contract businesses, must be subjected to a more rigorous screening process. We also support this approach for the provincial retail environment. A lack of oversight in the production and sale of cannabis will also increase the likelihood for abuse. Further, the OPP backs the recommendation put forward by the CACP to combine the medical and retail cannabis production models, and as such, eliminate the personal and medical production authorizations. This streamlined structure would assist the OPP and our policing partners in tackling illicit grow operations controlled by organized crime. In closing, I would like to offer that it is important for the federal government to provide clear direction to impacted stakeholders and consider time frame extensions in order to ensure the successful implementation of this act. The OPP appreciates that the legalization of cannabis, marijuana, is a complex process and that we, as a provincial police organization, have a significant role to play. The members of the OPP are committed to upholding the laws of Canada, and we look forward to working within the legislative construct provided to ensure our communities remain safe and our youth and vulnerable persons are protected. On behalf of the OPP, once again, I'm very pleased to contribute to this forum. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your contribution. Now we go to the Saskatoon Police Service, Deputy Chief Mark Chatterbock.
Good morning, distinguished members of this committee. My name is Mark Chatterbock, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Operations for the Saskatoon Police Service. And I'm also the co-chair of the Human Resources and Learning Committee for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, along with Steve Schnitzer from the Justice Institute of British Columbia. I'm pleased to be here with you today to offer perspective from the Saskatoon Police Service as we, like all municipal police services across the country, look ahead to the implementation of Bill C-45. I would like to begin by telling you a little bit about some of the challenges currently faced in our community and our province, and how the careful and thoughtful implementation of new legislation is vital. Saskatoon has been a city of rapid growth and economic boom, largely due to its resource sector, but in recent years the growth and economy have slowed. This has resulted in changing pressures on policing. We have seen an increase in property-related offences, and much of this increase is related to the illicit drug trade, specifically methamphetamine. We have seen a consistency in the percentage of our citizens who live each day at a socio-economic disadvantage, and some become subject to addiction, criminal victimization, become involved in criminal activity, and live in poor housing conditions or become homeless. And while this is a larger and broader community issue, it contributes to the overall environment in which we police. I would like to address the topic of impaired driving. We anticipate that as a result of new legislation, the number of impaired drivers will only increase. And this increase will be realized in a city and a province where impaired statistics are already far too high. Saskatchewan has had a long and unfortunate distinction of having the highest rates of impaired driving in the country. In an effort to reduce those numbers, the province introduced new legislation to toughen penalties for impaired driving, including a zero tolerance for motorists under 21 years of age who are impaired by alcohol or drugs. As a police service, we are already, as a police service, we are already proactive in terms of impaired driving enforcement. Each year, we conduct numerous impaired driving spot checks and openly communicate these spot checks to the public through traditional and social media, yet our numbers still remain high. As a result, the Saskatoon Police Service has concerns about an increase in impaired driving due to drugs or a combination of alcohol and drugs. And as our Chief of Police, Clive Wayhill, has publicly stated, he would like to know what happens when a driver, already found to have a blood alcohol content of 0.07, also has the presence of THC in his or her blood. Technically, this driver may be under the legal limit for both individual substances, but what effect does the presence of both of these drugs have on impairment? There were 43 homicides in 2015 in Saskatchewan. That is compared to 53 people killed as a result of impaired driving in Saskatchewan for the same year. In a province with a population the size of Saskatchewan, those numbers are very concerning. Unfortunately, our police service has yet to see a significant shift in behavior when it comes to alcohol-impaired driving. As a result, we strongly recommend considerable federal investment in public education prior to legislative implementation. We support the proposed amendments in Bill C-46, and the Saskatoon Police Service wants to be a part of the successful implementation for legislative change. We believe this will require continued collaboration by all levels of government and support for law enforcement agencies, especially for our frontline officers who will be facing the impact of these changes on a day-to-day basis. As we move closer to the date for legalization, the importance of creating a strategy to educate the public is becoming increasingly important, and we echo the CACP's position that the development of such a strategy should begin immediately. A public education strategy should specifically focus on information for youth, parents, and vulnerable populations. This component needs to be developed with input from all appropriate agencies, and the police would like to be a part of this conversation and preparation. Such a strategy should be non-judgmental, relatable, open-minded, and understandable. Education programs should provide real information, and evidence needs to be developed to resonate with this target audience. We will need to work closely with health and the school boards to adequately deliver this information to youth in our communities. Achieving a unified position will require close cooperation. Resources in our schools are already at capacity in terms of delivering drug awareness and other programming to youth, and this legislation will only increase the demand for delivery of more education. I would now like to discuss the impact that this legislation will have on police training. Considerable training will be needed in order to have specially trained officers able to detect persons who are impaired from drugs. According to the Colorado State Patrol, drivers who were stopped and found to be impaired by marijuana were pulled over as a result of speeding 91% of the time. Studies in Colorado also showed that the number of drivers testing positive for THC was highest during daytime hours. And we know that daytime is considered the peak time for when the highest number of vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians are using the roadways. Both of these statistics verify the need for specialized training for our frontline officers. The Saskatoon Police Service currently has 11 drug recognition experts trained, and I anticipate that we will need to at least double this number in the very near future. I expect this will also be the case for many other police agencies across the country. However, this training is expensive. It is currently only offered in the United States, and there is limited capacity, which means this training is often delayed until a space becomes available. For many agencies, this training will be cost prohibitive, which may ultimately result in delays at the roadside. Yet the courts, and justifiably so, will not see this as a bona fide reason to deny someone of their charter rights. As a result, I would strongly recommend that the federal government provide the funding and assistance required to implement a DRE program here in Canada, which will help to address the training costs and capacity issues I have mentioned. One of our concerns is regarding the unknown, and specifically not knowing to a great degree what impact this new legislation will have on our existing resources. Our resources are already stretched in many different directions. The Saskatoon Board of Police Commissioners recently hired a consulting firm to conduct a review of our operations, and their study found that the amount of time our frontline officers have available to conduct proactive activities is 29%, with a suggested goal of 40%. We already know that major drug investigations take considerable time and specialized resources, and they are very expensive to conduct. Can we expect that the number of major drug investigations will increase with this legislation? I believe we can. There's the potential for an increase in what I would describe as regular complaints to the police. For example, neighbor disputes, domestic disputes, suspicious activity, and so on. We know that alcohol is often a contributing factor in these types of complaints. The unanswered question is whether or not the usage of marijuana will have similar results. Many municipal agencies, including in Saskatchewan, have identified possible hidden costs which may arise with the new legislation. They would come in the form of social issues, which typically fall to the frontline police officers to deal with. I will end my time by commenting on the proposed legislation around personal cultivation and possession within a dwelling. The Saskatoon Police Service supports the concerns raised by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and recommend that personal cultivation be reconsidered. We do not support home grows, regardless of size or number of plants, as this will create opportunities for diversion. It will increase complaints of overproduction, which will be difficult to investigate and will have a negative impact on our existing resources. And arguably, home grows will provide more opportunity for cannabis to get into the hands of children. In closing, as a municipal police agency which will be on the front lines of the implementation and impact of Bill C-45, the Saskatoon Police Service wishes to express its appreciation for the government's commitment to consultation of stakeholders. We support the government's desire to implement the most effective legislation possible. We are committed to protect the public's safety and serve our citizens on a daily basis, no matter what challenges we face. On behalf of the Saskatoon Police Service, I appreciate your kind invitation to present our comments to you here this morning. Thank you.
And thank you for providing them. So now we'll start our 7-minute round of questions, and we're going to start with Dr. Ayelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, thank you all for coming. We appreciate your efforts in this. My first question is regarding, correct me, Mr. Sayre, I think it was you said that the usage of marijuana among youth in Colorado has increased since legalization. Did you say that?
The reports that we've seen had originally increased. We now have seen in more recent reports that it has started to stabilize. Mm-hmm. But the early reports from Colorado, once it was legalized, that there was an increase in youth consumption. Correct.
Okay, yeah, because we have I have a communication from the Attorney General of Colorado that cites multiple surveys, including the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics, that says there's no. Basically, it was in line with the national average. and the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that actually showed that in between legalization and before it was legalized and afterwards, in Colorado, that youth use had declined by 12%. That was one of the findings that, the main finding that they're citing.
There is a significant amount of reports out there regarding youth usage, and I am not exactly sure of the one specifically you referenced, but I have seen reports which had estimated at the onset that there was an increase of approximately 20%. I have seen a more recent report just as a week ago that indicates that youth usage is now stabilized and is just slightly below the national average in the United States. So I have seen that. But there was, in the onset, which really speaks to the public education portion of this and reaching out to youth about messaging about the dangers of cannabis use for young adults and youth. But our indications was initially, yes, it did go up.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more about education for youth. I think that's a key part of what needs to be done on this. Now, there were some concerns expressed about home cultivation, particularly exposure to youth, and that youth could get at it. Now, I brought up this example previously. We've had legalized home brewing of beer and wine for forever. Is there any evidence that there's been significant diversion of home brewed wine and beer to underage people? Is this an ongoing problem that we've had to deal with?
We certainly don't have any statistics on that kind of diversion. I don't think, and we anticipate that home grows will be much higher than what we see with home brewing. So I think our concerns are that we will see a lot more of the home grows than we certainly will with home brewing. So that's why we have a much more significant concern about that. Sure. And it's not just that about the access. It also has to do with the quality of the product being our experiences from attending to grow operations. With the molds that we've encountered in the residences, the issues with electrical thefts and the electrical systems and the dangers that are posed by that. And also, it will increase and cause more confusion for our officers on the road who are having to perhaps attend calls and now have to address somebody who may have 2 or 3 or 4 extra plants or a plant that's 50 centimeters taller than what it should be. So our lessons we have learned from Washington, Colorado is start restrictive, start slow, and then slowly as we start to unravel this legislation, we can start to perhaps look at some other opportunities such as that. But certainly we'd like to see it more restrictive and no home grows.
Okay, certainly. Yeah. Now, and I just wonder where this. There was a scenario that was stated. Forgive me, I don't remember who had said this, but talked about the if you had a 200 block or 200 unit apartment block, and if half of them had them. Do we have any data to suggest that on this regimen, half of the units in a 200 unit block would be growing for plants?
That was my scenario. I would suggest that I don't have any evidence that could prove that, nor do I have any evidence to say that it won't happen. The reality is, when you open the legislation, our position on that is that there's no need to do it when we're going to have a legalized system where people can access marijuana. So if we have an apartment complex or a smaller complex. Yesterday on my way here, I listened to a documentary on the CBC, a bunch of landlords that got together and talked about this. They're very concerned about how are they going to protect their buildings from these type of issues if home grows are legal.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Now, I agree completely with everyone here. Everyone agrees that we need resources for training, and we've talked about the money that the federal government's committing to this. Now, one of the things that was mentioned is increased training in recognition. Now, I understand that. I mean, again, I know that your forces all have experience with grow ops. So how much additional training would be involved? Because I would imagine that already officers know how to recognize these plants and how to recognize grow ops. How much additional training would be needed? And I'm not talking about the other issues like impaired driving, but just in recognition and dealing with grow ops.
One of the challenges for us with the training is that we haven't been able to even start preparing any training packages or training in any sense, because we at this point don't know what is going to be encompassed in both provincial and federal legislation or municipal. So we're sort of in a holding pattern, but certainly at the onset we are going to have to ensure that our members understand completely the legislation, their authorities under the legislation, both provincially, federally. But that is our challenge, is that at this point, and in talking to directors of police academies, that they have not been able in any way to start that preparation until we actually have the final legislation from all levels of government prepared. So that is where we're concerned and challenged. As far as how long that will take, again, that's difficult for us to answer right now, because we do not yet have all the answers that we need to make informed decisions about what that training will encompass.
All right. I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Moving to Ms. Gladu.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. I guess I took very seriously all of the comments that you made about the possible harms. And so I'd like to ask each one of you, in light of all of the things that could be very harmful to public safety, do you think that the government should be proceeding with legalizing marijuana outside the medical regime?
Deputy, do you want to take that one first?
Well, that's a difficult question for me to answer, because my expertise certainly doesn't lie in that area, and I would have to refer to my colleagues. I think the comments that I made earlier were more with respect to community safety, impact on our resources, impact on our ability to train our officers to be prepared for when the legislation does become in place. So in reference to your specific question, I'd have to refer to one of my colleagues on that.
So I guess in regards to legalization, that we support many of the goals and objectives of the legalization, that if done right, if invested in properly, if we take our time and do this appropriately, that we have the ability to disrupt organized crime, certainly not eliminate, we're not naive to that, but certainly disrupt the current share they have in the market, through education, like we have with cigarettes and impaired driving, to teach and educate our youth about the dangers of drug use. But it has to be done correctly. So I guess overall we support a lot of the objectives, but we have some concerns with the implementation and taking the right approach, taking a very methodical, systematic approach to ensure that this is done correctly, so that we don't see some of the issues that originally hit Colorado and others.
To add to my colleague's comments, I think it is very important to distinguish between legalization and decriminalization, and the importance that will be found in the regulations. And we do look forward to working with the government to ensure that there are robust regulations. Those regulations are going to rely upon heavily to be able to identify and disrupt organized crime, and also to protect our most valuable asset in our country and in our communities, which are our youth. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting question. I worked in drug enforcement for 12 years and have been in thousands of marijuana grows and all kinds of undercover street level situations where I've seen youth break into houses and cars and turn that money right into money to purchase, or turn those properties right into money to purchase marijuana. I've stood right beside it when that's happened. And I think there's a huge opportunity here to fix a lot of these issues. I have great concerns about the home grow challenges, and from everything that I've seen over our time in policing, along with my colleagues who have a very similar background to what I have. I have great concern about making it right for our youth, and anything in Ontario. I read all the studies in Ontario, and you can see the amount of youth that are using marijuana. It's very clear, so we need to do something. Again, another great opportunity to get it right. So I have concerns about home grows. I have concerns about organized crime is deeply involved in the medical marijuana system. They're deeply involved in that, and I have a package I can show you much more than what I spoke about in my few minutes there, where organized crime are involved in that. So we have a chance to get organized crime out of this. We really do. So we have to get the administration process low. We have to be streamlined, and we have to make sure the inspection processes are detailed and thorough, so we can eradicate organized crime from this problem. I also hugely agree that if legislation's ready to go July 2018, policing will not be ready to go August 1st. It's impossible. And the time that the damage can be done between the time of new legislation and police officers ready to enforce the law in 6 months or a year can make it very, very hard for us to ever regain that foothold. And so those would be my concerns and cautions from my lived experience as a police officer on the streets, working specifically in drug enforcement. I think we're very close. I agree that something had to change. This is a great step, but we've got to do it right and do it slowly and properly.
And so in 290 days, would the CAPC also agree that they're not going to be ready to go and to be able to implement anything?
Yes, we've stated that we need to know everything about this legislation from provincial, federal, municipal levels before we can really start to prepare. So we are asking that the government consider giving us more time to have all the legislation fully in place, so that which will allow us to properly train, prepare for the implementation on day one.
Definitely, I agree. It needs to be done right rather than rushing it. I was interested in your comments about possession limits. I agree that in order to send the right message to young people ages 12 to 17, that 0 is the right amount that they should have. And I liked the idea of making it ticketed so they didn't have any criminal offense that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What do you think about the possession limits that are set for an adult at 30 grams? And do you have any guidance in that light?
I can take that one. That had been a topic of much dialogue amongst our committee, and it is two sides of that coin. Is it, in one sense, if you make it too difficult for people to purchase cannabis, challenging for them, and they don't have reasonable access to a certain amount, that will certainly make it vulnerable for organized crime to fill that void in a market. Obviously, we don't want to see it made too high, because then that is open for diversion of the product. So in regards to the 30 grams, I mean, we are mindful that is approximately 60 marijuana joints. But we're also mindful that if it is not enough, that people who may not choose to go into a store or wherever that is to consume it, and may look to other avenues. So at this point, after much discussion, debate, that 30 grams is, we would certainly not want to see it any higher at all. But 30 grams would be the maximum limit that we would want to see it set at.
Very good, thank you. My other question has to do with organized crime. And so we've heard testimony that organized crime is involved in the medical marijuana even. And so regardless of what legislation we put in place, I guess I personally don't believe that organized crime is going to say, well, you're right, we've had a good run at it, but laws are in place now, so let's just license and do things by the books and go along with that. How do you really believe that this legislation will fix the problem of organized crime being involved?
This legislation will not eliminate organized crime, but there is an opportunity to mitigate the impact organized crime has in our communities. And that opportunity will be found in improved regulations, security clearances that are not limited to just the principals of the companies or license holders, but the investors, the contractors, the suppliers, extending beyond just a basic security clearance check and getting into forensic financial audits. If you follow the money, you will find the organized crime. It is currently a $7 billion illicit industry in this country. There are over 300 criminal organizations that are currently involved in the production, distribution, importation, or exportation of cannabis. So we can mitigate it, but we cannot eliminate it.
Time's up. Mr. Davies.
Thank you for being here today. I'm getting a very clear message from all of you, and I think it was said most clearly. I think it was you, Officer Barnum, that if I quote you exactly, we will not be ready August 1. That's impossible, I believe were your words. So let's say the government presses ahead with this artificial deadline of July 2018, and you're not ready. The next day, tell me what that looks like for your police forces. What are the consequences of you not being ready?
I think what it looks like is still up in the air for us. It depends when we start getting information about what the legislation is going to look like. So if we have good heads up, let's say 6 or 7 months out, we can start to work. We'll prioritize. We analyze all of our statistics, where things are happening, which highways our concerns would be for the impaired perspective, where we believe certain groups may challenge us with a lot of home grows or organized crime type things. So we'll try and do the best we can to, like I said, get that foothold and maintain that foothold without letting things get out of control. But it's so dependent on what the legislation looks like for starters, when we get it, and when we can have time to get our training and act together to respond to what the legislation is. So it's a tough one to answer, hard and fast for you. But the reality is, the sooner we get it, the better off we'll be, and depending what it looks like. So.
Well, I was just going to mention. Well, sorry, go ahead.
If I may add to the Deputy Commissioner's comments, I think one of the impacts we want to keep in mind in terms of rushing legislation and police not being prepared through adequate training is if we don't have the proper knowledge, the proper training, that can lead to poor decisions, which can result in bad case law for new legislation. So our opportunity to get it right will solidify the sustainability of the laws before the courts. That's why training is so important to us.
Thank you. And I would imagine, I mean, you're all provincial or municipal police forces. We all know that this system is going to require provincial decisions, provincial regulation decision, and perhaps I would imagine even municipal when it comes to landlord and tenant matters. How much of what you need to know is going to be dependent on the provincial and municipal regulatory system that has yet to be determined?
I think there's a significant amount that's been left to the provinces as far as mode of sale, the age, with the grows, home grows will be part of under their mandate. So there's a lot that we are still waiting for from the provincial government that we are going to have to, or we will require prior to us being able to draft our training, and also ensuring that we have the infrastructure in place. So as we talked about our concerns with the seizure of plants and our ability to manage that, what different facilities will we need is still a question that we have in order to manage our seizures of cannabis and elsewhere. So there is a lot left to be answered for us before we can even begin the process.
Okay. One of the purposes of the Act in Section 7E is the purpose of this Act is to protect public health and public safety, and in particular to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system in relation to cannabis. Is on July 1 or whenever this happens, is this scheme legislation going to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system from your point of view?
We don't believe so. In looking again to lessons learned from Colorado, Washington State, in fact, they did find that there was an increased capacity at the onset. As we stated, it's critically important that at the onset that we're very vigorous in our enforcement to ensure compliance with the new regulations. This is a brand new system, and we need to make sure that we do it right, and we go fairly strict with the enforcement. We know that there was, in 2016, I believe, approximately 16 or 17,000 charges for simple possession of marijuana. But we think that those will be replaced with ticketing. They'll be replaced with nuisance calls. They'll be replaced with us having to manage, if unfortunately we do go forward with personal grows, us having to manage those grow operations, which of course will be very time consuming and onerous for our officers, who will then have to seize the plants, take them back to a police department or a facility to store them, and that process. So we don't see this, at least at the onset, for several years, to be any sort of time saving for our staff.
Well, let me put this to you, because it's starting to appear to me that this isn't legalization of cannabis. This is making it less illegal. So whereas today you can't possess anything in the public street, you would be able to possess 30 grams. You still have to enforce someone who might have 35 or 40 grams. Presently, you can't cultivate at home. Well, this legislation will let you cultivate some at home. So you still have to enforce and police, but you'll be busting places that have 10 plants. So then there's the ticketable offenses, as you pointed out, Chief. So it seems to me that I don't see any reduction in your job. If anything, changing to a new regime strikes me that you're going to have to train a lot of your officers, add the impaired driving provisions, marijuana on top of that. And I don't really see any difference in the burden you have. In fact, if anything, it'll be additional. I want to move, if I can, Officer Barnum. What is the average size of grow ops that you encounter? How many plants, on average, would you encounter?
I'm not sure I have the average size. I've been in grow operations indoor for 45, 50,000 plants. I've been grow operations indoor where there's 8 or 9 plants that have huge yield and ton of potential to grow a lot of marijuana bud. I'm not sure I could give you an average size. Sir, it depends on organized crime. It depends on, the group, their abilities, if they have a good electrician, if they know what they're doing, the facility.
Okay, well, I want to be devil's advocate with you on this a little bit, because I would say the average grow-up is probably more than 4 plants. So let me put a couple of things to you. Doesn't it help undercut the black market if you allow people to grow 4 plants? Then they don't have to get their marijuana from sources that they would otherwise, we wouldn't want them to get it from. Isn't that one way to undercut organized crime?
I prefer to use the legal system that's going to be put in place.
Okay. And concerns like mold, electricity, diversion, those kind of things, isn't that really happening when you have large grow-ops? I mean, your average household has probably got more than 4 plants in it right now. So by limiting it to 4 plants, isn't that sort of a reasonable way to avoid those concerns of having, large-scale places in your basement, which do lead to mold and electricity? I guess what I'm saying is 4 plants, I think, reasonably probably wouldn't lead to these fears of electrical diversion and mold. Am I missing something there?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on who's doing the grows. If somebody tries to run 2,000-watt bulbs over their 4 plants, and you have to increase the size of electricity. They want a 14-week turnaround instead of a 40-week soil turnaround to increase their profit if they are diverting, or if they want a higher quality THC in their plant. These are all things they'll do. The average electrical service in a home won't satisfy that need. So that's going to be a problem. If you get people clumping together, let's say, us as a group decide, okay, I have a contact, I can get rid of the weed, but everybody needs to grow 4 plants, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do it, based on chemical-based hydroponic grow. Then you got problems with ventilation, and it's going to cause mold. You'll have a 14-week turnaround. You'll just be spinning plants through there all the time. So there's all kinds of things that can be imagined here. I think what's important is we don't sit back and think, well, there's going to be in the windowsill 4 little plants growing in a little bowl of soil, and sometime they're going to produce a little bit of bud, and maybe somebody's going to roll a joint. I don't think that's reasonable, not in today's world. That's not at all what we see and experience.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And now we'll go to Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with Deputy Commissioner Barnum. So you indicated that the security checks for licensed producers need to be strengthened. Health Canada currently contracts the RCMP to do their security checks. Do you think that there's something wrong with their process, or they don't go far enough, or they need to add functionality to their process?
I think it's important to recognize, starting with the large grows that'll be regulated and licensed, I think it's important to recognize that, in my opinion, and I might be on my own in this one, but I believe that's where organized crime will target. That's where the most amount of money they could make would be, and that's our biggest opportunity to get them out. So I believe we need more stringent processes than currently exist in the medical marijuana background check area. And I just look at, in Ontario, what we do with the Alcohol Gaming Commission in Ontario, where somebody applies for a liquor license at a bar, or they want a lottery license for some sort of event, or to run a part-time casino or whatever. There's stringent background checks, and like my colleague mentioned, there's financial checks that take place, and it's not just one layer. So my name's going to be on the license, so that's it. No. We need to know who your staff are, where you're getting your money to run this bar in this case, or where you're getting your money and your funding to run a legal licensed marijuana production facility. Where's that coming from? And then do those checks that way. So I would say it goes further than a criminal record check to see if somebody's got a criminal record. And I agree with what my colleague Tom mentioned earlier, that we need lots of layers here. So I would say what we see happening in the medical system, no, it's not good enough for what we're going to do in the legal system. You have more than that?
So does the current process that is just limited to criminal background checks? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Yeah.
I just wondering about that. I mean, we don't look at, if somebody wants to invest in a plumbing shop or something where you can make a lot of money. We don't do extensive background checks for legal businesses. So if this is a legal business, I'm wondering why we would do that in this respect.
And that's a great point, sir. And currently in legal businesses like a plumbing shop, we may not have already 300 criminal organizations established in an illicit industry, which is what we have today. We also have organized crime that have embedded themselves in a medical marijuana framework. So this is an opportunity to enhance the current security clearance process to try to identify those organized crime elements and mitigate the impact that they're having.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. I don't know who mentioned this, but there was some concern expressed that the limit for youth, young people, was 5 grams, and that this wasn't low enough. There's, I mean, below that level, it would be in the realm of what the provinces could do in terms of licensing and, in terms of restricting access. It would be a non-criminal matter. So the 5 grams is not saying it's okay to have less. It's just saying that we only enter the criminal regime at 5 grams. So currently, in Ontario, for example, you might ticket underage drinking under the provincial rules. Why would this be different in that than that?
I think we're saying basically we recommend the same. So if we have it's just like the Liquor License Act. If you're not allowed to possess it if you're underage, then you receive a ticket, or there's an option to give a ticket. So it doesn't criminalize or anything of that nature. So that's what we're recommending in Ontario, be the same type of process as what exists for the Liquor License Act. We'd love to see, and again, we've talked about this extensively, we would love to see a system where there's some education that's required. So instead of instead of a ticket, you could say to a person, depending on their age and the number of times we've encountered their issue, maybe there's an online forum they can go to and learn about marijuana and what it does to the developing age or the developing brain when you're 15 years old. So we'd love to divert that way, even better than a ticketing system. But the reality is that, too, is going to take a lot of time to get that organized and figured out. So in the first place, we believe for the youth, they don't need to possess it, and we could provide a ticket system if they're caught with 3 or 4 or 5 grams, whatever. Okay.
So that's certainly within the purview of the provinces to establish those kinds of things.
Yes, sir.
It seems to me that is a far more effective approach than criminalizing youth. So I would ask you if the 5-gram limit, at which point the criminal justice system could be activated, whether that should be raised so that there's more range for provincial intervention in terms of seizures and training and ticketing for youth.
Do you want to take it?
I guess just, sorry, from our perspective, we agree that for small amounts of possession that we do not want to see that criminalized. But we certainly have to advocate to our provinces to ensure that we have a system in place where we can seize marijuana from children. We can prevent it from being socially shared in large volumes at schools. So we're very alive to that. But unfortunately, that's something that we don't have the answers to in most provinces other than Ontario, and how that will be effectively managed. In regards to raising the 5-gram limit, we would be opposed to that. We think that part of this act is important, is that protecting youth is one of the key objectives of the act. And the message we send to our youth about marijuana possession is critical. And the higher we make that limit, I think we send a message. And I think it is vitally important that youth know that this is not a healthy substance, as you've heard from medical experts, and that we need to start an education program immediately to ensure they understand that. So we would be opposed to increasing that, and we're certainly advocating at the provincial level to give us the tools in order to ensure that no youth are in possession or social sharing marijuana at all.
So you do see then some value in being able to charge young people criminally for possession?
We would certainly want to see that the courts have some options in regards, as my colleague stated. We are very supportive of, for first-time offenses, et cetera, of finding diversion-type programs. We think that is incredibly important for these types of offenses. That being said, certainly for anybody, whether it be a youth or not, who traffics to other youth, we see that as a very serious offense. And if we're going to get a hold of or manage youth consumption in this country, we need to take it very seriously. But certainly somebody who is possessing, say 6 grams for personal use, we would certainly look to the courts to look at different types of opportunities, which they have at their hands as far as diversion and elsewhere to manage this effectively.
Time's up. Thank you. That completes our 7-minute rounds. We'll go to our 5-minute rounds, starting with Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I really want to thank the witnesses here today. It's a real concern for me that we're not going to get to spend a lot of time with you. I know the Liberals are rushing this through, but being that you're on the front line and you care deeply about the health and safety of Canadians, especially our kids like we do, it's unfortunate we won't have a lot of time with you. So it's also emphasized, I guess we're having a bit of a theoretical conversation today because it really emphasizes that on the ground, there's no certainty for you yet because it still has to go through the process. And it's interesting, some of our questioning yesterday, the government members thinking that you should be planning already for this and have everything worked out because we've been talking about it for 2 years since the Prime Minister made this surprise election promise. But anyway, I do want to see how this is filtering down to the ground. And we have asked provinces and territories to come, and only one decided to come, Saskatchewan. Ontario did announce that they have a plan. And because Ontario didn't want to come, I thought Deputy Commissioner Burnham, you could actually give us a couple of ideas on your initial thoughts on Premier Wynn's plan. I was wondering if you could tell us what you were glad to see, things that weren't in it. Specifically, how do you plan to address homegrown?
Well, I do like my paycheck.
And
so I'll be careful on my comments.
If you think that's in jeopardy,
Yeah.
please.
No, I understand that. I can't elaborate on much more what we've talked about already this morning of what we think that's vitally important. Again,
is there anything in her plan to address homegrown?
I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Haven't seen it. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm saying that it hasn't been shared with us exactly what the government of Ontario plans to do with homegrown. What we've seen is essentially what's been released publicly.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen anything either. And I did want to talk a little bit about the rationale of the Liberals. Like initially, it was a promise. It was a surprise for everybody, but they've developed a rationale. And one of the points was the status quo is not working. And we had witnesses yesterday. This is not true. They've refuted it with publicly available statistics that actually there is a trending down for youth marijuana use. The second narrative they're coming up with is keep the problems from organized crime. And again, RCMP yesterday said that's not true. Even Deputy Commissioner Barnum, you mentioned that organized crime, and I think Mr. Carrick, you also said you're not going to get it out of the organized crime. But I wanted to talk about the third thing they keep saying, this is going to keep it out of the hands of kids. Now, the bill before us has 0 repercussions for youth between 12 and 17. And you mentioned social sharing. You talked about the problems with home cultivation, the potential for crime, and even youth being targeted by organized crime for distribution. We're talking about 12-year-olds here, which in public school, they're the old kids. And when I was in public school, everybody looked up to the older kids. So is there anything in this bill that you see that's going to help keep marijuana out of the hands of kids? Maybe we could start with Mr. Sir.
Thank you for your question. In regards to this bill specifically, we've seen the penalties for trafficking to youth and the seriousness that is imposed, and that is important to us. In regards to us being able to effectively manage it, no, we're having to advocate to the provinces to give us the ability to, first off, to seize marijuana from youth, and then what type of mechanism will be put in place, whether it's a ticketing mechanism. So we don't know the answer to that. Under this bill, like I said, the trafficking to youth has been identified as a significant penalty, but beyond that, we don't have a lot of tools for specifically addressing youth in it.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it either. So I'm looking at the rationale, and really it's been deconstructed here just in the first couple days of witnesses. But another question that's been brought to my attention is how do you determine the difference between legal and illegal cannabis, especially considering home cultivation is allowed under the bill in its current form?
Yeah, Short answer is we can't.
Okay. Well, do you believe, given the timeline proposed by the Liberals to have marijuana legal in Canada, enough is being done to address public education? We heard from a witness yesterday. For marijuana education, they put aside, I think, $9 million. For tobacco, it's $38 million. And we already know a lot about tobacco. Most people who smoke, I think the witness said, no, it's a bad thing. We're spending $38 million on that. Do you see $9 million making much of a dent in an educational program?
You know, we will advocate that we absolutely need public messaging. And the lessons we learned from Colorado and Washington State was you need to start now. We needed to start a year ago, quite frankly. You know, there are some misconceptions out there about youth and drug-impaired driving and the dangers. It's not, many haven't seen it as the same risks as they do to alcohol. As far as how much money we need, I can't specifically answer that question because we still don't know what we don't know on some of the sides of the legislation. But what I can say is that we absolutely need to invest in a very robust, continuous program with educating not only the youth but also parents, you know, teachers, public about the dangers of youth consumption and the dangers you know, that are imposed by marijuana consumption. So,
well, time's up. Sorry.
Mr. Ayub. Yes, Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure if you're not bilingual, I'm going to ask the answer the question in French, so that would be easier for me. Présentement,
currently, the current situation on the ground, you work on the ground and you know what's going on in the streets and in the schools with our youth. Is there currently consumption by youth? The answer to this, well, I would imagine is yes. Is cannabis currently being used by youth, in your opinion? Mr. Barnum.
est-ce qu'on a assez?
Do we have enough staff? Is this issue being addressed sufficiently at the current time?
Specifically from enforcement perspective, or
Any kind of solution? Do you feel that you're having the tools to address the problem right now?
no, I think we could always use more people to work with the youth in our communities to make sure they understand about the harmful impacts of any type of drugs.
Mon point là-dedans, c'est de savoir que présentement,
My point is that currently it's a situation that is ongoing. We can always do better. We can always improve. And there's a prevalence of crime. It's never a flat line. It goes up and it goes down, and you adjust subsequently. Currently, we're in a situation which is described by all of the industry as not working. For 100 years now, we've been doing things the same way, but we realize that our youth are the greatest consumers of marijuana in the OECD, in the Western world. And so we need to change the way we do things. We need to seize this opportunity, and I understand what you said. We need to seize this opportunity to do better. But you said that there are challenges about
prêt à 100% toujours dans la même façon.
about being ready. I think that we're not ready to address the current situation right now. You said we can always improve and have more staff, always do more. And furthermore, the statistics, well, I would like to know whether you have statistics on direct crime that is directly related to cannabis, whether it's impaired driving or the labels that you give specifically for cannabis versus drunk driving. But what I understand, and every time I ask the question to police officers, they have more statistics on alcohol behind the wheel than cannabis. And I would like to know whether you have statistics specifically on cannabis versus alcohol. Do you have this type of statistic with you?
Statistic with us. We're certainly, in regards to drug driving or impaired driving, we are preparing a response on behalf of the CACP for Bill 46, in which we'll be able to drill down further into some of those statistics to get a better understanding of that.
J'aimerais bien que vous puissiez les partager avec le comité.
I would like for you to share them with the committee, please, these statistics that you currently have, because I'd like to see the before and the after. With respect to preparation, I'm a bit perplexed. You said that you're waiting for the legislation, and I understand that there are certain details on the legislation that you need to wait for to focus on this. But in the meantime, what are you doing to prepare yourselves? Are you doing nothing? Are you waiting for the legislation, or are there still some things that you are doing to prepare? Because this has been in the pipeline for over 2 years now, this legislation to legalize marijuana. There must be things you are working on. I'm sure that you're working on it. Can you tell us, in the 45 seconds that remain to me, can you give us an idea of the situation and where you are in your preparation, and what is your plan to prepare for this objective?
From the perspective of the Saskatoon Police Service, we are having conversations in terms of how we will respond in the future. But it's true that until we actually see the legislation and the regulations, it's difficult to know exactly what we're going to be faced with. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, sort of the fear of the unknown and not knowing to a great degree how our calls for service will increase and so on. So part of the challenge will be once the legislation is implemented and we start to sort of track our calls for service and so on in the community, we won't be able to react until we have a good sense of what we're faced with. We're also engaged with the province at a fairly high level at this point, so we're going to have to do more consultation with the province in terms of what they have in mind in terms of provincial regulations as well.
Time's up. Now we go to Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to kind of follow up a little bit as well on my last one. You know, we realize that Canadian youth do use cannabis too much, and we're saying we're going to go from one system that the government says isn't working. Those statistics may suggest otherwise. But I was wondering, as police officers, if you could actually explain the tools in your toolbox today, because it is illegal. If you pull a youth over who's 17 years old, if you smell marijuana in the car, if you notice that they have marijuana in the car, because it's illegal, you don't have to prove that they're impaired. You don't have to worry about swabbing their cheek to see if it has been consumed. You don't have to worry about a blood test. You have tools in your box that you can actually address that youth. Perhaps I think the goal would be to put them into a treatment program or talk to their parents. How is it going to be different now for you pulling over a young person under the new legislation or theoretical new legislation? Are you going to have the same tools to address that, or is it going to be worse? Is it going to be better? What would you think?
Do you want to take that?
Sure. I think we have the potential, and the CACP's advocated for this for a long time, and we've been, you know, I think a very clear voice for a long time about a ticketing scheme for young offenders and for young people. So I think it will be nice to have the opportunity to provide a ticket if that exists. So that's one thing that would be an extra tool for us, so to speak, if you want to call it a tool.
Does it need to be legalized for that, or could you do it a different way under today's framework with decriminalization or something like that?
It really does vary from province to province. I think it's well documented that British Columbia has a far more tolerant approach in policing marijuana, and typically, a lot of times, quite frankly, it's taken away from a youth, and that's the end of it. You know, certainly we want to ensure that youth cannot possess. We want to ensure that we have the authorities under certainly a provincial statute to take away the marijuana from a youth, and that is our primary concern. We also think it's important that, you know, that there be a system, as my colleagues stated, in regards to having an opportunity to ticket and perhaps educate. We've advocated that that monetary fines probably is not the best approach, certainly for first-time offenders, that looking at something like an online app or an online program where youth can have to take a mandatory course to be educated on the the dangers to persons under the age of 25. So we do need tools in order to effectively deal with it. And I think currently right now some of our systems of just taking it away is not appropriate, because I don't think the lessons are being learned, and we continue to see high youth consumption. And really what we want to see through an education program like we've seen with tobacco, and through rigorous campaigns on tobacco, is we've seen a drop in youth consumption and consumption overall through these very active campaigns. And I think we can do the same if we invest the money if we invest the time and resources into that.
And I agree with you, but we'll both maybe agree that none of that is actually in this bill, that the federal government is going to be left to the provinces and territories. Next question I think is going to be for Deputy Commissioner Barnum. Stronger security screening on those producing and distributing. I'd like to find out what you would like to see, because we recently had Health Canada, there was a big recall for pesticides and fungicides. And it's interesting, even with the medical marijuana system, it appears that the government's not putting in the resources to properly inspect these facilities. Moving forward with legalized marijuana, recreational marijuana, if the government isn't putting enough money into inspectors and overseeing the facilities today, what would you like to see the federal government do with opening up the market like this?
Perhaps I'll share that answer with my colleague, Deputy Chief Karik. Firstly, like I mentioned before, I think it's important to have a layered process. So it's not as simple as getting a license to grow by just having your name on a certificate and have somebody do a criminal record check and say, okay, there's no criminal record, or it's old, so they can have a license. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think it's important to understand that it needs to be a layered and thorough approach. Background checks. Again, for what we have in Ontario, I routinely permit our officers to travel around the world to check on individuals that are claiming companies from out of the country to be part of, be part of the casino system. So they travel around the world to do these background checks to make sure, this business is supposed to be in this community, in this country, and it actually is there. And they do have the staff that are working there. So we actually do that type of regulation background check. So I think that type of approach is vital to make sure that the money that goes into these facilities to produce a legal product is actually legitimate, and it's going back into the community legitimately.
Do you have confidence, though, if the government can't do it with the medical system, that they would do it with a recreational one? Okay.
Thanks very
I thought
much.
I could get one more question.
Well, you're very good at that, but
yeah, thank you.
We're going to give you another chance.
Lots of questions. I wish we could have more time with you.
Ms. Sidhu.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here today. My questions to OPP today. Thank you for serving 13 million people.
Do we have
I have heard, I did a roundtable in my riding. Some people are accessing, I heard that very loudly. People accessing illegal cannabis that is laced with some dangerous drug. Imagine along home grow plants, 4 plants, and legal market wouldn't make cannabis use a lot safer instead of when it's our youth is taking laced drug. Can you comment on that?
I guess the potential is if somebody was to grow their own marijuana in their house and just use it in their house for their own personal consumption, then they would have control of the product from the beginning to the end. That would be probably better than reaching out to somebody on the street and getting a product that you don't know. So yeah, I would agree that in a perfect world scenario would be good. But I also would recommend that you better be careful about how your home grow is wired, how it's being ventilated, who has access to it. Is somebody going to, come in and decide they want your 4 plants instead of leaving them with you? So I think there's just a lot of layers there. Before you get to the perfect nirvana where somebody's sitting in their living room smoking their own marijuana in their own privacy of their own home, there's a lot of layers before you get to that point, and I think that's what we're trying to point out here.
Okay, thank you. And could you please talk about a little bit current landscape of cannabis sales in storefronts or otherwise a link to organized crime?
Yep. Currently in Ontario, we believe there's 140 dispensaries approximately that exist throughout the province. whether or not those are directly related to organized crime. We haven't done the investigations on all those communities. Many of them are in municipal communities, municipal policing communities. So we work with our partners to try and understand the landscape. And I'll share this answer with my colleague as well from the Organized Crime Committee, but I would say definitely there are organized crime involved, and some of which we specifically know about in some of the dispensaries. But to give you the exact number, I would say you'd be probably 10%.
Okay. You also spoke about 6,000 officers need training. And our federal government committed $161 million for training frontline officers how to recognize the sign and symptom of drug-impaired driving, building a law enforcement capacity across the country. Don't you think it will help to control that crime?
If I got your question, you're saying the money that's being committed will help for the training?
No, you said
sorry.
you need 6,000 people, police officer need training up front if we're legalizing that. So when our government is commitment, $161 million for training frontline officer, don't you think it will help to legalize that thing when they train the officers more on that?
I believe the money will help with training our officers, but I also believe there'll be more costs involved. Again, if you look at the diversity of the OPP and the geographical challenges we have to train 6,000 officers, it takes a long time to bring somebody in from a community in the far northeast or northwest to a central location to have them trained. It's expensive, and it takes us a long time. We've been over 4.5 months now of rolling out naloxone to every one of our officers, and that includes a training regime. So it does take a long time. And I don't think we're trying to be unreasonable and saying that it can't be accomplished, and we look forward to actually doing it and working alongside. But all we're asking for is the reasonable opportunity to do it in an organized fashion that can be effective.
Thank you. And Mr. Sir, you said youth consumption for cannabis in youth is very much, everyone knows that it's it's a serious problem. To deal with that, we need to educate youth. Do you think what kind of education program will be needed? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, certainly we need an education program that's specific to youth, that resonates with youth. So, I would certainly look to the experts for that as far as a public messaging campaign, I think, is part one. Part two is we have school liaison officers who we believe need to be trained, in addition to the training that we've just talked about, in order to, work with schools, work with educators to educate on the dangers of youth consumption and change the perceptions that are currently out there. I think we also have to remember we have to educate parents, because it starts at home, and we have to, see that the parents are understanding the concerns and dangers for youth consumption. We have observed in, for example, Colorado, I believe it was 22% of youth have obtained their marijuana from their parents, which is certainly concerning to us. So that education has to extend not just to youth specifically, but really to the whole community, so that we can, start to change those statistics that we see about youth consumption in Canada.
Time's up.
Thank you.
Mr. Davies, 3 minutes.
I understand and respect that there's different philosophical approaches to drug policy in this country, but I want to press a little bit on the general idea of moving to legalization. Alcohol prohibition, from the 30s, if we look at what happened then when it was illegal and prohibited, we had organized crime, you had illegal stills, you had machine guns in the streets, you had thefts and break-ins, that sort of thing. And as we've moved to legalize that product, and by the way, which is a dangerous product, I think we all recognize alcohol is responsible for a lot of health problems, a lot of death, a lot of violence. We have moved to a situation now where people can access it legally. You can home brew your own wine and beer. I would dare say that every person in this room has a liquor cabinet of some type at home, so alcohol's in the home. And we're not seeing diversion of alcohol to the black market. We're not seeing people break into houses to steal liquor on any grand scale. So my question is why would it be any different if we simply add cannabis to that as a intoxicant that people choose. I recognize there'll be a transition period, but over time, wouldn't we expect to see a very similar social rollout with cannabis? What's the difference between cannabis and alcohol and the way that society's dealt with it?
You know, it's interesting when we talk about pre-prohibition because we do talk about statistics and evidence, and I don't know what evidence or statistics we have for the pre-prohibition of alcohol. That would be very interesting to learn what the crime rates were back then. What we do know is impaired driving by way of alcohol is the #1 criminal cause of death in this country. So if we are to expect that the use of cannabis may go up, that causes us great concern because that puts our communities at peril if there is even one more incident of impaired driving, and that impaired driving is impaired by drug, which we know happens today. It's unknown what is the combination when you combine drugs and alcohol. We've heard all sorts of statistics from our neighbors down south of the border that it's got a great impact, up to 28% increase in the amount of intoxication. That creates a great danger behind the wheel. You are correct that we're not seeing as many residential break-and-enters for alcohol, but I can tell you back 10, 15 years ago, that was a primary reason for young people to break into places to get alcohol. We all know that youth take alcohol from parents' liquor cabinets. So you're right, we really do need to concentrate on the education and the awareness of our youth and our parents and our educators and our healthcare practitioners so we can mitigate the impact of legalizing cannabis and keep our youth as safe as possible.
Thank you. Thanks.
We're ahead of schedule, so if there's unanimous consent, we'll go for another first round but with 4 or 5 minute questions. I know Dr. Carey's anxious to have a few more questions, but I want to compliment the panel. You give the most concise answers of any panel we've ever had, so we're ahead of schedule, partly because of that. So we're going to start off with 5 minute questions with Mr. Oliver.
Oh, great, thank you very much. There was a suggestion that you're being rushed by the committee. We've structured this so that you have, if our normal committee meeting was on a day, we have 2 hours of questioning and testimony, and that's exactly what's unfolding here. So thank you very much for your participation in this. I had a question. I thought I heard from one of your testimony that there was a concern that organized crime had infiltrated the medical marijuana production facilities. So my understanding is that the RCMP does quite extensive background screening for any of the applications for licensed marijuana producers for the medical system. They go back over 20 years. They look into the owners' associations over current and past. They look at the criminal intelligence that they've gathered around those applications. It includes looking at the spouse and the family members, back again, those associations over 20 years. So the example I had is if your brother-in-law owned a bar that was frequented by Hell's Angels, you could be denied a medical license to be a producer. So I guess I'm a bit concerned at that comment you made. Do you feel the RCMP isn't doing their job adequately, or did I misunderstand your testimony? Or could you elaborate on that for me, please?
I think one of our concerns with the licensed producers we know are vetted strongly by the RCMP.
We have a guest here, and I respect our guest very much, Parliamentary Secretary Blair, but throughout these meetings, he's actually been leaning over, having conversations with our witnesses. And it's totally inappropriate. I realize these are former colleagues of his, and like I said, I do respect him. I respect the fact that he has this file as his responsibility, but if he's going to be at this committee table, he needs to stop leaning over, interfering with our witnesses. I don't know what he's saying to them, but this is at least the second time I've seen him do that. So, point of order, Mr. Chair, I'd like you to address this right now.
Well, as a member of Parliament, he's entitled to be here, entitled to be at the table. So.
And what is he doing?
Well, he's at the table, and I would ask maybe he would offer a thought on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I accept the concern from the honourable member, and I'll refrain from any further conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
To address your question, so we are aware that the RCMP does do fairly rigorous inspections or checks on licensed producers. One of our main concerns with the medical regime under the MMAR is the designated and personal production licenses, which we do not have near the same level of rigor. We do know organized crime, without any doubt, is involved in both of those uses, and that is our primary concern, and why we're asking for
individuals are given a permit to grow their own marijuana for medical
Yeah.
purposes, and you have a concern. But just to be very clear, the licensed manufacturers do go through or producers go through quite rigorous screening. I wanted to be clear on that.
Yeah.
I just want to come back to, is this legislation better than the status quo? And particularly in mitigating, at least reducing some of the access that organized crime would have to this work. So right now, it is 100% supply. It's a legal supply, so it's all black market, other than the medical marijuana side. So I think you mentioned this, but just could you say again, do you see any reduction in access of organized crime to some of this market with this legislation?
There's definitely an opportunity here to impact the organized crime elements related to cannabis. As we mentioned, it's a $9 billion industry. What we need to do as law enforcement officials, though, is now turn our minds to where does this decrease in profit, if the Cannabis Act is successful, and it does result in a decrease of profit in the black market for organized crime, where do they turn their attention? Do they turn their attention to other illicit drugs that present greater dangers to our community and make them more available to our youth? So that's something that is a policing profession.
I believe the federal government has just made an infusion of financial support to help with criminal investigations. Is that correct?
We did hear the announcement, which we acknowledge that financial announcement is going to assist with our efforts, and it will be, as I stated, incumbent on us to make sure that we are thinking one step ahead of organized crime. And if we do reduce this market for them, where do they turn their attention to recover those profits?
And then just on your capacity to be prepared for this legislation. So at the federal level, I mean, we have to distinguish, I think, pretty clearly what is federal and what is provincial, territorial, and municipal in this. So at the federal level, I mean, it's pretty clear right now. If you're under the age of 18 and you're holding less than 5 grams, there's no criminal charge. If you're over the age of 18 and you're holding under 30 grams, there's no criminal charge, and the residents' growing rules are clear as well. So at a federal level, in criminal charges, it's pretty clear, is it not? Is that it's really at the provincial, territorial, and how the ticketing and how the provincial applications will apply that the uncertainty rises for you, but you could prepare for the federal law today, could you not? Assuming this bill is passed and goes through the legislature.
Yeah, assuming that there's no changes, there is a fair bit of clarity in this act that we can certainly rely on. You know, that being said, though, you know, the process for ticketing is still yet to be determined. You know, how that process
is provincial, right?
But there's also the federal, or the implications for a person that has between 30 and 50 grams. You know, that process, and so we still need to work with, you know, Justice and Health Canada on the application of those different laws, you know, that would fall under this act. So we have some ideas, but certainly we can't develop a full and robust training package until we really have the full training, you know, the full picture of how this will roll out.
All right, time's up. Okay, Ms. Gladue, and you're going to share your time.
I'm going to share my time with Mr. Carey.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. I know. Quick. Yeah. So, is it any problem to you that the government federally has sort of downloaded most of this to the provinces to let them all figure out their own rules, and so you may have 13 different systems across the country? I would ask Mr. Sayre.
Yeah, we certainly have advocated for the more uniformity that we can have across the country would be advantageous for us from not only a training perspective. You know, certainly the provinces are deciding on age, which could be a complication depending on some provinces having a younger age, which would create, you know, a cannabis tourism potentially. So we would like to see that there's more of a national scope of this, yes.
Very good. One of the unintended consequences or things I found disturbing from Colorado was the suicides among adolescents 10 to 19 years, 16% of them were found to have marijuana in their system. Do you have any data on what the situation is in Canada in terms of suicides among our young people, which is epidemic, and how many of them are containing marijuana at death?
We don't have any specific information regarding youth suicide and the finding of THC in their system, no.
Okay. I'll turn it over to Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to put something on the record, this narrative that alcohol prohibition and marijuana prohibition. The CMA was here yesterday, and they said it's not the same, especially for youth and especially for brain development. And my uncle, who's a police officer, he said to me, he says, just because you've legalized one substance, which you've rightly said is the number one cause of death in driving, why would we want to legalize another one that's going to give us problems? And I think the status quo today, if you pull someone over, you take them off the road, and immediately you can pull them off the road. Public safety is maintained. You don't need to do these swabs. You don't need to do the blood tests. You don't have to prove in court that they've been impaired. So my question is for these officers on the ground that have to take on this duty now. I was wondering if you could explain what is the difference between an officer who is trained in the field of sobriety testing to detect drug impairment and a drug recognition evaluator, which I believe is recognized now as an expert with the Supreme Court.
Could I raise a point of order?
Yes.
So we're dealing, sorry to interrupt, so impaired driving is a very, very important topic. It's a concern, I think, for all Canadians that we have proper control of it. But we're dealing with Bill C-45. At some point in time in the future, we're going to have to do a clause-by-clause review of C-45, which does not deal at all with impaired driving. It's C-46 deals with all of those kind of questions, concerns, and the training. And the Justice Committee is dealing with that. So I'm just concerned that we're taking time, very important time, away from being able to question these witnesses about Bill C-45, directing it to C-46, which is another committee's job and another bill. So I don't know whether it's a point of order, Mr. Carey, or Dr. Carey, but I just think at the end of the day, we have to do a clause-by-clause review of C-45, and it's silent on this topic.
You know what? I really appreciate you bringing up that comment, because one of the things for Health Committee we have to address is the health and safety of Canadians. And for public safety concerns, I believe it's really important that we get the opinions of the people on the ground when they're the ones responsible for the health and safety of Canadians on the road. And we have good evidence to suggest that there's one substance out here. We're talking about another substance to get their opinion on that. And I think it does fall within the scope of this practice or this study. So thanks for that. I appreciate you letting me comment on it.
Thank you. Just briefly to the point of order. I've struggled with the same concept that there is a separate piece of legislation dealing with the impaired driving regime. But in fairness to Ms. Dr. Carey and all members of this committee, I believe that's companion legislation that it's necessitated by this legislation. We probably wouldn't be talking about the need to construct to amend the criminal code to deal with impaired driving if we were not legalizing marijuana. So I wouldn't want any member in this committee to be restricted from talking about that if they wish. I myself, I'm going to be limiting myself to C-45 as much as possible, but I do want to speak in favor of Dr. Carey's ability to venture into that if he wants, particularly from a health point of view.
Thank you.
Look, this is a health committee, but we are going back and forth between justice and health issues all the way through through this panel, and just let's restrict and try to focus on the health issues, and we'll just continue on. But let's just try to keep a focus on health issues. Everybody has a point here, but we are dealing with. Just look at the uniforms here. We're dealing with justice issues quite a bit, and even though it's health committee, they are interrelated in this.
But there is a definite science, Mr. Chair, when we're talking about an ordinary officer who's trained in sobriety, which I think all officers do get training in. But we have drug recognition experts who we've heard that are going to be absolutely necessary if the government is going to roll this out. They have to be on the ground. Mm-hmm. They have to be prepared. The courts are accepting only drug recognition experts as experts in court. And now with it being a legal substance, there is a science behind this. There's absolutely health issues behind this. And I want to hear from our guys on the ground. They have very few of these experts available to them today, and in 290 days, this is the Prime Minister's been very adamant about. This is a promise he's going to keep. I want to make sure that the health and safety of Canadians is addressed, and these people are going to be absolutely necessary. And the cost of this is also an important thing for this committee to address, because my understanding is it can be up to $20,000 per officer to get this training. So this is, I want to hear from the guys on the ground.
Thank you for your testimony. Go ahead.
I could probably respond to that. The International Association of Chiefs of Police website lists the process for certification for DRE training. So everybody who's involved in the program first has to take the standardized field sobriety training before they attend the DRE program. And then the program itself consists of 3 phases. The first phase is a 2-day preschool. The second phase is a 7-day classroom program with a comprehensive written exam following that. And then between 60 and 90 days following phase 2, the candidates then attend a program down in the U.S. where they have to evaluate subjects who are suspected of being impaired by drugs. And my understanding is that they must participate in at least 12 evaluations successfully in order to then get the certification.
What percentage pass, and how long does that whole process take for one officer to be trained?
I don't have an answer to that question right now.
All right. Well, I think it's something that my understanding is not every officer does pass this. This is a very specific training program, and my concern is on the ground, if the government does roll this out, that those officers will not be on the ground and they won't have the resources to properly look after the health and safety of Canadians.
Do you still have time?
Oh, okay. That maybe for Saskatchewan, do you have an opinion on the best way to distribute marijuana once it is legalized? What model would be easier for police to monitor?
Sorry, specifically in reference to which models?
Well, that Ontario's come up with a model that I think they're focusing on the LCBO type of model. We've seen, I think, a very good model where, for medical marijuana anyway, there's a secure mail. I don't know, and maybe your colleagues could comment on this, but my understanding there hasn't been a lot of diversion from secure mail. So there's a lot of different models that are out there, and again, because of the hodgepodge that provinces are going to be faced with, one province can do it different than another. We've seen Ontario come out. Of course, they don't want to come here and be questioned on it, but for police, what's the best system of distribution that allow you to monitor and keep the safety of Canadians in mind?
Well, I think the best system would be one that allows us to differentiate between illicit and licit marijuana. I can't tell you exactly what that system would look like because I don't know enough about that.
Okay.
But certainly a system that would allow us to enforce the legislation and the regulations as best we can.
Deputy
Now your
Commissioner
time is up.
Barnum?
Okay, going to Mr. Davies.
Buck, you mentioned, I think if I had your testimony correct, that you felt that once C-45 comes into place, investigations will increase. Can you elaborate on that? How do you think investigations are going to increase under this bill?
Well, I suspect that once the legislation is in place, we're going to get more, especially if it's the way the legislation is worded now, we're going to see an increase in complaints with respect to home grows, specifically. Mm-hmm. As I also mentioned in my opening remarks, we anticipate that we will also see increased calls for service, whether it's with respect to street robberies, break-in enters, and so on.
Thanks.
But certainly around the grow operations themselves.
Thank you. Chief Barnum, I think you mentioned the geographical challenges. I'm wondering, the OPP, of course, has the entire province of Ontario. Can you sort of tell us a bit about what are the rural challenges that you see this legislation maybe presenting from an enforcement point of view provincially?
Well, from an Ontario perspective, we have 164 detachments spread across the province. Some of those detachments we access by airplane only. Those members there will have to be trained as well, because it's important to recognize that our officers Monday morning may report to their detachment no matter where it is, and Monday afternoon be working at an event somewhere in the province of Ontario. So it's not as if we can certainly categorize who gets training here and there. It has to be uniform throughout the province. So that's a challenge for us as an organization all the time, and one that we routinely deal with. But we deal with it through specifically organized training sessions and an academy that looks after that. So that would be one of our challenges. As far as the enforcement perspective, again, it's important to recognize we're in 373 communities in the province of Ontario. Some of those communities have streetlights, some of them don't. And again, we're in 54 court jurisdictions. That's every court jurisdiction that exists in the province of Ontario. The OPP has a responsibility to provide evidence and be in those court jurisdictions. So uniformity is absolutely key for our organization to, as my colleague mentioned earlier, we don't want to be in the front page by making bad decisions and doing bad police work. And training is a cornerstone to making sure we do it properly. So we're well positioned to deliver the training once we know what it is. And we're well positioned to meet deadlines, and we do that, and we can move resources to make sure that happens. And those would be our key concerns around that issue.
Thank you. Have a little bit of time. Chief Sir, I'll just end with you if I can. In a March 2017 interview on cannabis legalization, Mary O'Harrell, the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, said, "We need about 2,000 drug recognizant experts to do the job properly. We have about 600 now. We need more training. It's going to be a long process. We have to realize that we won't have enough police officers trained by next year." Two quick questions. Do you concur with that? And second, there was, I think Chief Chatterbock talked about maybe setting up a Canadian training capacity instead of having to send Canadian officers to the States. Can you elaborate a bit on who will do that and where does the money come from and whether that's possible?
Yeah, so quick answers to your questions. I do concur with Chief Harrell. As far as 2,000, that's a very good estimate on his part. It actually, we don't know what that exact number will be. One of our challenges is police officers are trained and then they're also moved to different assignments, which also poses an ongoing continuous challenge in training. But we need a significant increase in drug recognition experts for sure. And then part two to your question, I'm sorry. It
was on Canadian training instead of having to send officers to the States.
Our concern right now is that the capacity for that availability of that training. It is through the U.S. It is expensive, and currently the U.S. Police agencies have a vested interest in training their members in that, which take priority in many cases. So we need a made-for Canadian policing solution to this, and we need to bring that training here if possible, if we're going to train that many officers quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ayub, 5 minutes.
Sorry.
I would like to know your opinion. Well, earlier, Mr. Carey mentioned a movement in organized crime because we're making an economic pie of what's available for resources into organized crime. And cannabis is a source of legal revenue. If the pie is reduced, if the portion available to organized crime is reduced, so logically, will that reduce them and harm them economically? Because that's an assumption that means that we're changing the paradigm and we're moving the problem elsewhere. But we need to address the problem. We need to address what we know. And if we can predict it in advance, that would be a good thing. Do you have an idea of where the movement would go? I'd like to hear you on that.
You're absolutely right, sir, in that we do not avoid addressing a problem because it will shift the problem. We have to utilize systems thinking and a strategic approach to this. We just need to look at the drug usage across Canada right now. One of the great concerns that we have is obviously the use of opiates and specifically fentanyl. So as a policing profession, a lot of our efforts and attention are turned towards the use of fentanyl, and we'll continue to concentrate on the distribution of fentanyl fentanyl and ensuring that we are spending significant amount of time, energy, and resources in mitigating any interest that organized crime may have in expanding into that space. We know that cocaine is a very lucrative illicit commodity for organized crime, and that's another one that takes up a lot of our interest, a lot of our time, and is transnational. So there will be no shortage of illicit drugs for us to spend our time and attention on.
J'ai entendu souvent
I've often heard the comment of people on the ground, not necessarily police officers, but particularly students as well, people who are in high school particularly, or in CEGEP in Quebec. They tell us that, well, their testimony tells us that they're able to get marijuana much more easily than cigarettes or even alcohol, which is controlled. Cigarettes and alcohol are controlled in quite a rigid way. How can we identify the problem for youth and how can we protect our youth in the principles of this bill? Because that's what we really want to do. We want to hurt organized crime by taking its means away from it and taking away revenue sources, but we also want to protect youth. What is your opinion on the fact that our youths are saying that it's easier for them to get cannabis than it is to get alcohol and cigarettes?
Yeah, we don't disagree that youth right now have easy access to marijuana, and that's certainly a challenge for us in law enforcement. We do believe that youth, even under a regulated model like with alcohol, will still be able to access marijuana. We're not naive to that. And that's why we believe it's so important to have a highly regulated system, which does make it more challenging for our organized crime investigators to really put some pressure on organized crime to dissuade them from, selling to youth. But, youth and educating parents as well will be critically important. Well, like I said, as we've seen in Colorado, I believe it was 48% of youth have actually received marijuana from somebody who had purchased it legally. So again, that's why we're advocating for packaging, that the packaging describe the very strict enforcement action that can be taken on someone who essentially bootlegs marijuana, and that is critically important. So youth will always be able to, at some point, access it. We think if there's home grows, it gives them more opportunity to access it. So anything we can do to restrict and limit their opportunities will be helpful, but it's not going to be enough alone. We certainly need education, like we have with tobacco, in order to disrupt youth use.
Une des choses que je me rends compte et puis que j'apprécie énormément.
One of the things that I've noticed, and I think that it's part of a lot of the debate on the legalization of cannabis, is that we talk about it a lot, because in the past, we say now that there is an issue. It exists. It's there every day. We can go on the street, and it's disconcertingly easy to get cannabis. But we didn't talk about this before, and yet the problem still existed, and we didn't address it, the problem among youth. So I think that the education piece is so important, because parents have a role to play, both for alcohol, cigarettes, and in the future for cannabis. And that's something that I think that is extremely interesting. We need to update information and education, and we need to focus on, well, applying the law is one thing. Sometimes you have departments who are close to the schools, close to the community and municipalities, and you conduct interventions in collaboration with these groups. And I think it's important to continue to move along these lines when we're addressing cannabis. And Canada has an opportunity to be a leader in this field, because our youth are among the highest consumers of this drug. And if we don't address it, we will be losing these opportunities. So I'm happy to see that you are attacking this with a positive attitude and you're focusing on addressing it in the future. I congratulate you, and we will work together. Your comments will be taken into account. Thank you. I have no other questions.
Very much, and that winds up our session. And I, on behalf of the committee, I just want to say we have some of the best expertise in the country that come to this committee, and this panel is amongst the best. We really appreciate your contribution. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank you all for you've done a great job of communicating your perspective and helping us understand the policing point of view. Before I say goodbye, I want to ask a question. About an hour and a half ago, Deputy Chief Chatterbox said in his opening remarks that the frontline officers have available to conduct the time frontline officers have available to conduct proactive activities is 29%. Could you help the committee understand what the other 71% of a police officer's time is taken up with? What?
Certainly, the majority of the time would be responding to calls for service.
Yeah.
But there's also administrative time on top of that, including, preparation of occurrence reports, filling out paperwork, phoning witnesses. There's a whole host of things that would fall into the administrative part of the duties.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, and thanks again. Been a pleasure. We're going to suspend now until